In this country, in 2008, we had a housing crisis. And it was sparked by a number of different factors, a particular kind of weird alchemy that people were trying to do with derivatives and very exotic financial products that thought they could alchemize something terrible into something beautiful, and it wound up collapsing the housing market. And we saw the implications of it immediately. I lived in Atlanta at the time, and the home that I purchased lost 70, not 70% of its value. And in communities around the country, we saw devastation. Many people's homes were foreclosed, and for people whose homes were not foreclosed, they found themselves, as we called it then, underwater. And so if a person needed to move, or a person needed to sell their home, or any of the kind of life exigencies that come up, they found that they could not sell their homes. And as a consequence, we saw foreclosures spike. One house in the neighborhood is boarded up, which then impacts the value of another house nearby, and another house nearby, and it had this chain effect. And these foreclosures showed up on people's credit. And you saw a record number of people in the United States who had bad credit. Now, typically, when we think of the credit system, we think of it as fairly objective. That if you are a responsible person, you pay your bills on time, that you will wind up with decent credit. You may have a blip here or two, you may have a period where you're out of work or some difficulties, but generally the law of averages, these things will all wash out and we'll have a fairly representative example of how responsible you are as an individual in your financial dealings. But by 2010, that really wasn't the case. What we began to see was a set of people whose credit did not reflect specifically who they were, so much as it reflected where they lived and the particular broader dynamics that they were attempting to navigate. And so the students were with me, and I said, for many African Americans, this is how we have long seen the criminal justice system. That having a criminal record may or may not be indicative of anything about you personally, but it certainly is correlated greatly to where you live, what kind of policing you're exposed to, what kind of community dynamics there are, and the likelihood that you could be arrested. We've known this for a long time, and we look at the kind of vast disparities around things like marijuana. If you are a person of color, it is likely that you will go to prison or be arrested if you are found with marijuana in your possession. If you are a white person, there is a dramatically lower likelihood that if you are found with the same amount of marijuana that you will be arrested. And we can find these parallels at every level of the criminal justice system. If you're African American, you're more likely to be stopped and frisked, which means that if you're a person who is carrying something as contraband or controlled substance, you're more likely to have it found, you're more likely to be arrested than a white person with a comparable amount of the same controlled substance. If you are arrested, you're more likely to be charged. If you were charged, you are more likely to be convicted. And if you are convicted, there was a story that just came out just today, as a matter of fact, pointing out that district attorneys tend to give more favorable deals to white defendants than they do to African Americans. And so we have reached this point where we talk now increasingly, when we say something that sounds counterintuitive at first, where there are large numbers of people who want to remove from employment applications any documentation of the question of whether or not someone has a criminal conviction. Now, on the face of it, this seems kind of weird, like a weird request. Like, why, if I'm an employer, why would I not be able to have access to this information? I want to be able to know about the trustworthiness, about the potential violence, about lots of things that concern me if I'm going to employ this person. This person may be around cash. There are all these things about this person's character that I want to know. And what we're finding is that, like credit in 2010, 2011, a criminal justice record, a criminal arrest record, is not necessarily that indicative of who it is that you're dealing with. And so I say this to say, this sounds great and touchy-feely and so on, but there's actual data around this. Like, we live in the era of big data. We can find out lots of information and about virtually anything that we want to know. And so about 6 months ago, I was invited to California, to San Francisco, to give a talk to a group of people at the headquarters of Uber. And actually, it was a little bit more than 6 months ago. It was back when people still liked Uber. And so, like, a couple of months after that, I've been like, I don't know. I can go talk to Lyft. They invite me, I'll go talk to them. But I went to the headquarters of Uber, and I was talking to them about an initiative that they started. In California, there are a number of people who are low-level offenders who had been cut out of the employment process. If they do a background check and they find that you have a criminal conviction, you were not going to be hired. And so because Uber has an incredible amount of data, they know not just the ratings. You all know that you get rated, that you can look up your own ratings? Yes? So I'm one of those hyper-competitive people. I looked up my rating and saw that I was 4.62 out of 5. And I was like, I was not happy for like the rest of the week. And then I found myself doing things like tipping my drivers really well, trying to put my thumb on the scale and boost my score. But in any case, they know your rating. They know how the driver is rated. They have data on how fast the car was traveling. They have data on the relative safety practices of the driver. They know all these sorts of things, so they can actually create a model and see what the behaviors of their employees are. So having this kind of finely calibrated information at their fingertips, they decided to conduct an experiment. And they selected several hundred people who would have otherwise been disqualified from employment, and they hired them. And they monitored these people over the course of 6 months. And to their surprise, they found that the people who had previously been blocked from employment because of their arrest records wound up being equal, actually slightly higher than their general pool of Uber drivers.